No one is using this model that Dragon Ball was using. Just no one. It totally upended the game. Everyone was like, this is brilliant. Why aren't we all doing it? Let's all do it.
Hey, and welcome to the inaugural episode of Dragon Ball Rewatch. Sponsored by CBR. It's the official CBR rewatch of all things Dragon Ball, and starting from the original series all the way through Super with Z and GT somewhere in between. I'm Sam Stone.
I'm
I'm
Alex
John.
Frankly. Oh,
I'm John Greenall. This is already going very well.
Well, let's start things off. I mean, we're talking about the very first episode, The Secret of the Dragon Balls. But before we launch into it, like, what were some of your what was your gateway into Dragon Ball?
John.
Oh, see, I started watching Dragon Ball about the time when it was being rerun alongside Dragon Ball Z.
Mhm.
So they would do like an episode of Dragon Ball and an episode of Z, which is a very interesting way to watch the shows. Because a lot of moments when I was watching as a kid, I remember going, "What will Goku do after this kung fu tournament? Will he go somewhere else?" Then Dragon Ball Z episode comes next, like, "Well, he's fighting aliens now." So I presume somewhere between these 2 points, something very strange happens. And I fell in love with Toriyama's design. His art and how he does characters is so just mesmerizing. How he pulls things together from all these different sources, but still makes it so uniquely his own. And yeah, I was just hooked.
Yeah, I was a Toonami kid, so I would rush home every day when Dragon Ball Z was airing. I'd run into my grandma's house and I watched Raditz get him beaten up at least 7 or 8 times while we waited for the Funimation dub to kind of catch up with where the Ocean dub left off. And I just remember watching that show and not having ever seen anything like Dragon Ball Z before and being really, really into the style and the action and kind of sitting on the edge of my seat. And I came to Dragon Ball itself a little bit later when it became more accessible in the United States, and because Dragon Ball didn't hit Toonami until I think like 2006, 2007. I'm not sure,
A
but
little earlier. It was like 2003, 2004 or something like that.
yeah,
Yeah.
what a flash in the what a strange time for Toonami. But I like many other millennials have that feeling in my heart when we get to that part of the Frieza saga and it's just like, oh, it's just gonna start again.
Yeah. Yeah. No, for me, it was very much kind of the same thing. I remember watching Dragon Ball in the late 90s, or Dragon Ball Z more accurately in the late 90s on TV, like on Cartoon Network, and seeing stuff from the Saiyan saga. And I remember the first time, I happened to tune in the first time that Goku went Super Saiyan because I wasn't watching it every day, at least not initially. And then blew my mind. I was like, what is this? He went supersonic? Because I didn't know about Super Saiyans before Sonic the Hedgehog. And yeah, no, it's from there on, it's been going back to Dragon Ball and just being a kind of a faithful fan of the franchise ever since. But yeah, I mean, here we are at the start of all things, the original Dragon Ball, which is based on the which you can stream on Crunchyroll and Hulu, and you can read the translated manga through Viz Media. This episode adapts the first episode, and it's a pretty faithful. It's maybe as faithful an adaptation as I think we ever get. you know?
There's like only one scene that isn't in the manga, and that's pretty much just a scene from later on. They've just pulled forward. And that's only from from chapter 18, that
Yeah,
extra scene.
that's
So it's not
really.
even that far out.
I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
I think to start with though, it's kind of interesting to talk about like that this is kind of the start of modern shonen in general. Like this is the very beginning, like the shift that happens in especially battle shonen because of Dragon Ball. Like this you don't get Luffy, you don't get Naruto, you don't get any of these characters without Goku getting shot by a teenage girl first.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
so remember this came out, the chapter came out in 84, the first episode came out in 86, and you can totally see how not just Shonen changes, but Shonen Jump's whole model changes after Dragon Ball gets big. And now that's just the default.
yeah.
Don't think people appreciate that enough. If you go back and read sort of early 80s Shonen Jump, no one is using this model that Dragon Ball was using. Just no one. It totally upended the game. Everyone was like, this is brilliant. Why aren't we all doing it? Let's all do it.
Yeah.
It's this kind of shift away from it's not even a shift away, but it's an evolution of what Tezuka was doing when he was telling his stories, when you have Astro Boy and all of that, and then you see this as kind of a natural progression, especially in the more round shape language of the earlier parts of Dragon Ball. But we got to talk about the episode, not just about the aesthetics of Dragon Ball.
Well, and to John's point, we do get one thing that isn't in the manga. We get the introduction of Emperor Pilaf, which I presume was done to show that there are more sinister forces going after the Dragon Balls. These 7 collected items that can grant any wish that the Eternal Dragon can muster. And it's interesting that scene because it does kind of throw off the pace of the episode overall instead of just being the Goku Bulma like show.
Yeah,
I do think it's important.
So for context, the basic plot of this episode is that we get a bit of Goku's before life, seeing him doing some fun in the forest, doing some fishing, unconventional fishing. Do not try this at home. He meets Bulma. They discuss the Dragon Balls, and we have Pilaf, who is being introduced to the concept as well. It does throw the episode off, but I would argue it's a really good choice because it does widen the world quite a lot and gives a hint of what's coming.
See, I like the stuff with Emperor Pilaf because it gives a bit more of a threat than the original manga chapter does, because that chapter really is about setting up the 2 main characters and setting up the quest. But this gives us an opposing force for them to work against. But at the same time, I also I really love those early interactions between Goku and Bulma. That almost instant sibling relationship that comes up is just it's so fun, it's so interesting, and it carries on throughout all of Dragon Ball very, very well. That is something that even in the Broly movie that came out in 2018, that relationship still exists, and I think that that's very interesting. And it all starts again by Goku getting shot. That's the thing that I kind of want to go back to is Bulma's first shoot first, ask no questions. Bulma, best Bulma.
Yeah, I think it raises a lot of interesting questions about the world in that moment, because that's Bulma's first reaction. It's kind of telling you there is something in this world that's quite dangerous if her first reaction to any situation is, I'm going to pull a pistol on you.
And she's a 16-year-old with a pistol ready to go.
Yeah.
What I actually really like is that if you notice this, this is one of the first examples of a Dragon Ball retcon that's set up here.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
In the manga, she does not hit him. She stops just before. He gets booted in the anime, but when we go back, I think it's about episode 80, we'll see a flashback of this moment, and they change it so he doesn't get hit. So even the Dragon Ball animators were like, maybe that's a little too far.
Well, yeah, I mean, I love the slapstick here. I also love that we get something as wild as giant dinosaur men as early as this episode, which become a kind of a staple, at least in original Dragon Ball. And I think for anyone that comes into this like we did, having watched Dragon Ball Z first, I think they'll be struck how much more of a fairy tale and less of a sci-fi action story this is. Because that really is kind of hey, it's an adaptation very loosely of Journey to the West, or at least uses that as an inspirational springboard. And I think if you go in with that in mind, that hey, this isn't all powering up and energy blasts. This is a fun kind of action adventure comedy. It's a more rewarding watch.
And I really want to say, probably talking about sort of bringing people in, I would argue that first 5 minutes is the greatest setting up of your stall in anime history, because it does so many little things to sort of clue you in on the world. Because you start off with the deer, it's oh, hey, so it's sort of a version of our world. Oh, no, there's a dinosaur, so it's a bit different. And you see Goku immediately on that log that kind of establishes, hey, he's a young boy, he's playful, but he's definitely not fully human. Just immediately, because here's all these questions that you should be thinking about as we go forward. And what I really like about that first bit that doesn't work for us as much, but it works for the Japanese audience. They're clearly marking Goku as Kintaro, the folklore character who also wrestles the earthquake fish. So it's a really good way of saying, here's your elevator pitch in these. If you've just turned on, here's your story. Here's your questions, and we're going to go full force.
I think that also carries over to when he meets Bulma, because we start in this very natural world. We start with all of these animals. We start in all of this foliage with Goku working with his hands, like hunting for his lunch. And then you have a car, and you have a pistol, and you have all of this technology that is much more quote unquote modern, even though it still has a fantastical element when we find out later about the capsules, and the conservation of matter means nothing in the Dragon Ball universe. But it's really interesting to have that dichotomy, because it's also a dichotomy that happens with Pilaf later too, because he's also the technology guy. Like that, like the technology as an opposing force to Goku himself, who is very earthy or chthonic, if we want to get really classy with it. There is something very interesting about that and how it sets itself up, especially with later interactions. But this episode is also just so great for the voice acting. I just want to give just the way, because we only have like 2 or 3 voice actors in this episode, and they're bringing the whole thing together. And Bulma's voice actress has always been great. Like, she's amazing.
Yeah,
Tiffany Palmer does a good job. I will say I do have a few little issues with the voice acting in this episode, and that is Goku's voice clearly isn't there yet. They're still kind of debating where he is, because he does go very Californian in a couple of sentences that doesn't fit. And some of his slang, the slang they use, I get what they were going for, because they're trying to go, oh, he only learned slang from his granddad, so it's all outdated stuff. Like, he says golly a couple of times, and he calls talks about Bulma's fanny, which I kind of understand, but it just feels so against the visuals. Mm-hmm. They do, so I think you can immediately tell they go against that, because pretty much starting episode 2, all of those elements vanish.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Stephanie Noldeny does a great job. She also voices young Gohan in DBZ, at least the original DBZ Funimation DBZ dub, not DBZ Kai. She's also does stuff with One Piece for all you One Piece fans out there. So I think she does a good job. But yeah, they're still figuring. I mean, just like the show is still figuring itself out, the Funimation dub is still figuring itself out, because it's a different beast than DBZ.
Yeah.
And I think that, I think I always remember enjoying it. But whenever I show somebody Dragon Ball, I usually skip straight to Goku and Krillin training under Master Roshi. And it's like, cool, if you enjoyed that, there's like these like 18 or so episodes before this, where everybody gets introduced, because
that's the point where Dragon Ball becomes what we'd associate as Dragon Ball more. I think you could argue that these first 18 episodes are more Dr. Slump than they are Dragon Ball.
Yeah.
Which is great, because I love Dr. Slump. But definitely someone coming in whose only experience with Toriyama is Z, they're probably gonna have a bit of an issue with this early episode. But
I think the other thing I really appreciate about Dragon Ball that got, like, later anime do a very different thing with this, but I appreciate that we know up front there are 7 Dragon Balls to collect. I have a firm belief that if an anime does not tell you how many of a thing you need to collect, you cannot trust that anime. Inuyasha ruined me for any. You don't know how many Shikon Jewel shards there are, but you know that there are 7 Dragon Balls. Like, it ruined me for that. But I appreciate how it gives you the premise in such a quick manner, and it carries through. It's like there are 7 Dragon Balls. They give you a wish. Bulma wants a boyfriend, and that's where our story really starts. And I like the simplicity of that, because it allows complexity to build on top of it.
It does feel like from this first episode that there is a story going forward. So it does, that having it be 7 and know from the start what they're going to do, really, even in slower episodes down the line, kind of keeps everything moving, because there is this end goal, and they're not just playing for time and trying to come up with what's next. It's sort of the author is signaling. I think it kind of, you see it in this chapter of the manga as well. It is Toriyama signaling also to Jump's higher ups to be like, if this first chapter doesn't do well, don't worry. I have a plan. Give me a chance and you'll see there's something really good here, but you've just got to wait.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember seeing it's been going around since Toriyama passed, the end page of Dr. Slump, where he's like, stay tuned for Dragon Ball. And it's like, oh man, if only to have been a Japanese reader in like 1984, just to get your like mind blown by what was coming next. But
I mean, with this particular episode, I think it's interesting to kind of talk. It's always interesting to talk about first episodes of a show you've seen before, because everything, you can see the anticipation. But for a first time watcher of Dragon Ball, I'm kind of curious about your opinions on if this would be enough to keep a first-time watcher who has never seen Dragon Ball, never seen Z, never seen, let's say, like never seen like a Toriyama show. Like, do you think it's enough to keep someone interested? Because I think it would be, but I think that people would disagree with me in a lot of ways because of how slow it is. So I'm interested.
I think I agree with you. I think it would pull people in. I think there's enough questions by the end of the first episode that are left just enough that you feel there's an answer coming to them. And this first episode has a bit of everything for everybody, which I quite like. So if you like combat, they clearly hinted that, hey, Goku's a really good fighter. If you like sort of the Bulma Goku relationship, you get a bit of that, and you have that villain. I definitely think this would get a second watch. I do think, though, that you're right. I think a modern audience would be hoping the second episode picks up a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and I think that's the biggest surprise, that it isn't so much the tone, it's the lack of, because it's really just Goku against the giant dinosaur, which goes down very relatively easy. No energy blast at all.
No,
He doesn't even have the Nimbus yet. We'll get there. But it's yeah, like you were saying, John, it is a little more Dr. Slump, and that sense of humor becomes more evident as we progress into the series, right?
Which is going to be a problem for modern viewers because it's definitely not the humor I would say is in vogue today.
who's ready to
Um,
get put on a list, guys?
I definitely think I've at this point become accustomed to it because I've watched too much 80s anime, but it definitely is a very different style of comedy.
Yeah, I mean, the last shot of Bulma in this episode is her like peeing from a tree.
Yep.
So there's that.
So much is going to happen with Bulma.
Oh, poor Bulma.
Oh,
I do think
Bulma.
it's very interesting looking at this dub because obviously we're using the more modern dub. Is to keep in mind there were attempts to bring Dragon Ball over earlier, but they
Yeah.
all failed. And sort of rewatching this now, when you sort of hang around Dragon Ball fan spaces, you hear sort of a lot of people say, "How did they ruin this? How did they miss out on this obvious classic?" And you go back and watch it, and you go, "I would not want to be the person who was trying to pitch this to a notoriously conservative American censorship board because there's just so much."
I
You can see
remember.
why they cut it to ribbons originally because there's just so much you would not get away with.
There's so much interesting stuff about like how these anime were distributed at the time. Like even the foundation of Funimation is interesting because it was just like a Toei executive calling a nephew who like lived over here, being like, if you can get a company off the ground, I can give you the rights for this. Like it's a very interesting story about all these different dubs, especially when you talk about the Ocean Cast and like how basically Funimation couldn't continue with them because they stopped being able to afford them. Like it's but I understand why it took, especially in the 90s, why it took so much effort to bring it over here. Because if you remember American cartoons in the 90s, if you remember the era of the 4Kids dub, like remember Pokemon Donuts?
Oh yeah, 4Kids cutting everything, whole shows. Like it was very, very common for international networks to cut shows to absolute ribbons. I know famously the one of the first dubs they were trying to show in Canada, and I think then there's the old joke of the Canadian network that brought over the British sitcom Red Dwarf
Yeah.
and turned a 30-minute episode into a 3-minute episode, and that was much tamer than what you see in these early Dragon Ball episodes. So you look now and go, there was no way this would have taken off, especially because, again, this is sort of 95, 96. We're still very firmly in cartoons are for children and children only, apart from The Simpsons, but even that isn't appropriate for good, wholesome Americans. Because this is also the era where The Simpsons was getting massive controversy in the press. So there's no way you're getting Goku trying to use his genitalia to fish past the censors. Like, no way. You're being chased out of the office and banned.
I just wonder how effective that is.
That's at least an HR complaint.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah,
the 1 million subscriber special sorted.
Yeah, different era. And it's, I think, something that we'll be saying, having looked ahead, I think it's something we might be referring to in episodes in the immediate horizon. But yeah, just to kind of close out, like, what do you dig about this first episode? Like, what do you, as a gateway into the wide world of Dragon Ball and television?
For me, it's still just how brilliantly it lays everything out. How you can sort of reduce this episode into a series of bullet points of here's a few character traits for each character that stand out. Here's what you need to know about the world, and here's just this list of questions going forward. Like stuff like what is Goku's tail? What are the sort of why are the Dragon Balls a thing? It really just in this first little bit tells you everything you need to know, but doesn't tell you enough that you won't come back next week to learn a little bit more.
Like I love like just to bounce off of that, it feels like a thesis statement. You know, it feels like that beginning of your essay where you're trying to hook your reader, and it works very well because it is fantastical enough and familiar enough where the audience can kind of jump in and still enjoy. I The thing that I really love about these early Dragon Ball episodes really is the music. Like it gives that real sense of fantastical adventurous energy, like that upbeat, like da da da. It's really good, and just for the music alone, it hooks me in, and I think that it as a thesis statement works very very well.
Yeah, it's Shinsuke Kikuchi is the composer. And yeah, it's brilliant. It's beautiful. It's beautiful music. And you know, for me, this kind of it's very I have trouble reminding myself that Dragon Ball Z started in the 80s, started in 89. Like it feels like a 90s show. Dragon Ball feels very much of its era, both with its animation quality, its music, and its, you know, and its tone and sense of humor. And yeah, I'll always appreciate it for that kind of time capsule quality. But you know, I think, you know, this is a good time to remind our viewers that yeah, you can watch Dragon Ball on Crunchyroll and Hulu. You can read the English manga on at Viz Media through Viz Media. Next week we've got the Emperor's Quest episode 2. So I'm looking forward to that. This is Dragon Ball Rewatch. I'm Sam.
I'm John.
I'm Alyx.
Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you guys next time.